think about it and see. 1985 was, of course, not the first or the last act of international terrorism in the Middle East. There are many others, some of them quite important. For example, in 1975, Israel, meaning Israeli pilots with U.S. planes and U.S. support, in December 1975, they bombed the village in Lebanon, killing over 50 people. No pretext was offered, but everybody knew what the reason was. At that time, the UN Security Council was meeting to consider a resolution which was supported by the entire world with marginal exceptions, only one crucial exception, the United States, which vetoed the resolution, calling for a diplomatic settlement of the Israel-Palestine conflict, incorporating UN 242 and all of its wording of the main resolution, security and territorial integrity and all those nice things on the internationally recognized border. The offending part of this one was that it also referred to Palestinian national rights, and that's not acceptable to the United States. It rejected them then, it rejects them now, contrary to a lot of nonsense that you read. The U.S. vetoed the resolution that terminated, and this continued, still going on, in fact, year after year of efforts at diplomatic settlement, which the U.S. has unilaterally blocked. Israel doesn't have a veto at the Security Council, so they reacted to the debate by bombing Lebanon and killing 50 people without a pretext. That's not in the annals of international terrorism either. There are many more recent cases, including the two invasions of Yitzhak Rabin and Shimon Peres in 1993 and 1996. U.S. supported in Lebanon. U.S. supported both of them. Lots of deaths, hundreds of thousands of people driven out, and so on. Clinton had to back off his support for the 1996 invasion after the Kana massacre, over 100 people in a UN refugee camp. At that point, he said, "Can't handle this anymore, he better leave." There was no pretext of self-defense in this case. This is just outright international terrorism or maybe aggression. And it continues. So let's go up to the current intifada, which broke out on September 30th of the year 2000. In the first couple of days, there was no fire from Palestinians. It was stone throwing. But Israel was, in fact, using Israeli U.S. attack helicopters to attack civilian complexes, apartment complexes, and so on, killing and wounding dozens of people in the first few days. The Clinton administration responded to this by borrow our president's phrase, by enhancing terror. Recall Bush condemned the Palestinians for enhancing terror last month, so I'll use his phrase in line with the guidelines. The Clinton administration committed itself to enhancing terror by making, on October 3rd, by making a deal for the biggest shipment in a decade of military helicopters to Israel, and along with spare parts for the Apache attack helicopters that had been sent a couple of weeks earlier. That's enhancing terror in the days right after these helicopters were being used to murder and wound civilians, attacking apartment complexes, and so on. The press cooperated by refusing to report this. Note, not failing to report it, refusing to report it. It was specifically brought to the attention of editors, and they simply made it clear they're not going to report it. There's no question about the facts, incidentally. But to this day, it hasn't been reported, except in the margins. That policy continues. Skip to December 2001, last month, 2 months ago. George Bush was condemning the Palestinians for enhancing terror, and he contributed in the conventional way to enhancing terror, in crucial ways, in fact. On December 15th, the UN Security Council debated a European-initiated resolution calling on both sides to reduce violence and calling for the introduction of international monitors to assist in monitoring a reduction of violence. That's a very important step. That was vetoed by the United States. It went to the who want to enhance violence, evidently. It's hard to think of any other interpretation for this. The press didn't have to bother giving an interpretation because it was barely reported. It then went to the General Assembly, where, as far as I'm aware, it wasn't reported at all, and there was an overwhelming vote supporting the same resolution. This time, the United States and Israel were not entirely isolated in opposition. Several Pacific islands joined in, Nauru and one or two others. So therefore, not the usual splendid isolation. I don't recall that was reported. About a week before, 10 days before that, there was another major contribution to enhancing terror. The Fourth Geneva Conventions, according to the entire world, literally, outside of Israel, apply to the occupied territories. The United States refuses, doesn't vote against this when it comes up in the United Nations. It abstains. I presume the reason is the United States does not want to take such an open, blatant stand in violation of fundamental principles of international law, particularly because of the circumstances under which they were enacted. Recall that the Geneva Conventions were established in order to, right after the Second World War, in order to criminalize the acts of the Nazis. So saying they don't apply is a pretty strong statement. However, outside of the United States and Israel, the whole world agrees. The International Red Cross, which is the agency responsible for applying and interpreting them, agrees. In fact, there's no, as far as I'm aware, no further question about this. Switzerland, which is the responsible state, called a meeting of the high contracting parties for the Geneva Conventions, that is, those, like the United States, that are legally obligated by treaty to enforce them. It's a high, solemn commitment. Called a meeting on December 5th in Geneva, and the meeting took place, passed a strong resolution determining that the Geneva Conventions do apply to the occupied territories, which makes illegal just about everything that the United States and Israel do there. They went through the list, settlements, displacement, everything that goes on. The United States boycotted the session. They got another country to boycott them, Australia. According to the Australian press, under heavy U.S. pressure, Australia joined in boycotting them. If the U.S. boycotts it, it's like a negative vote at the Security Council or the General Assembly. Didn't get reported, and it's out of history. Okay, but that's another important step to enhancing terror. All of this took place, incidentally, in the midst of a 21-day truce, one-sided truce. Palestinians weren't carrying out any acts, but a couple of dozen Palestinians were killed, including a dozen children. That was right. It was right in the middle of this that these efforts to enhance terror took place. Maybe that's an unfair interpretation, and there's some other motive that I'm not thinking of, but that's what they look like to me. You can think about that. In any event, international terrorism in the Middle East certainly continues, has a long history. And if you look over the record, of course, it's mixed and complicated, but I think you'll find that the balance is pretty much along the lines that I described. In fact, the balance reflects the means of violence available, as it usually does, if you look around the terror. In fact, that's why in the whole range of terror, state terror is far worse than individual terror. For the obvious reason that states have means of violence that individuals don't have, or groups. And that's what you find if you look, I think, overwhelmingly. It's commonly said that terrorism is a weapon of the weak. That's completely false, at least if you accept the official U.S. definition of terror. If you do that, then terror is overwhelmingly the weapon of the strong, like most other weapons. Well, that's history, but all of this stuff is out of history. History is what is created by well-educated intellectuals, and it doesn't have to have any resemblance to that thing called history by naive people. And I think if you check this, you'll find that that's true. Well, that's the Middle East. Let's turn to Central America, the other main focus of the plagued by depraved opponents of civilization itself. Here I'll be brief, because at least the core parts are just uncontroversial. At least uncontroversial among people who have minimal regard for international law and